I'm Matt Corser from the Strengthening and Sustaining Ohio Suicide Prevention Coalition's initiative. Welcome to Segment 12 on Strategies and Approaches to Build Community Readiness. If you're watching this video, probably you already have your Community Readiness Assessment report, or you soon will have it. Our agenda today is to describe those next steps that happen after reporting has been completed. We're going to introduce strategies to build community readiness. We will introduce the process for creating a plan to build community readiness. And we will identify templates, guidance documents, and other supporting materials to help your coalition create an actionable plan to build community readiness for comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. The question this segment really answers is, well, now you've completed your CRA. What do you do next? In one sense, after you have your CRA report, your work is just beginning. The first step is really to start to understand what those CRA results mean. And that really means looking at those dimension-specific scores, the overall readiness score, quotations, and other information gleaned from that interviewing and scoring process. You'll be engaging your community, reviewing those results with stakeholders and your coalition members. You'll start to identify approaches to build community readiness, and you'll match those to the readiness level of your community and also to the larger context of your community as well. You'll begin planning for implementation of those strategies. And ultimately, you're going to work to implement those approaches and strategies to build readiness. And it's really important to know that the key focus of those strategies to build readiness, that's really going to involve mobilizing your community and building their willingness to work in partnership with you on those comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. It's important to remember that your community's level of readiness may not be high enough to immediately implement comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. Your community may not be aware of suicide as an important public health problem. It may not be aware of the CDC technical package and the 7 strategies in that package. Your community may not be ready to mobilize, or it just may not be willing to work with you on that issue. As you work through this process, keep in mind what we call the readiness paradox. You and your team, your coalition, are probably more ready than your community at large. And that's really because you and your team have benefited from training, funding, and other resources that your community doesn't have. And as you're focused on these approaches and strategies to build community readiness, what you're going to be doing is working to move your community closer to your team's level of readiness. Now, as we move forward, I want you to keep in mind a few things. The first is that throughout the CRA process, you've been practicing data-driven decision-making all the way through. It's also important to know that your CRA process and the work that you're going to undertake to increase community readiness, it's going to map on to just about every planning process, including the SPIF, and it maps well onto a community logic model. Keep in mind as well that your community readiness assessment is only one part of a larger needs assessment process. Oftentimes, this CRA functions as a foundation to a needs assessment process. And as we talked about, your CRA is going to fit very well into the development of a comprehensive strategic plan for suicide prevention in your community. Let's talk next about approaches to build community readiness. What are approaches to increase community readiness? As you're working to build community readiness, that simply means that your community is going to have an increased level of willingness to work on or to work with your coalition on comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. And building readiness may also mean that your coalition and community may have more capacity and resources to work together on those comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. It's also important to know that your work to build community readiness to use that CDC technical package and implement comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention may not directly impact suicide as a community health issue. What it's going to do is set the stage for programs and strategies that will do that. Approaches to build community readiness, they're going to be tailored to the level of readiness of your community. And they may be focused on that overall level of readiness, or they may be focused on specific domains of readiness that scored lower than the others. You're going to need to make sure that those approaches and strategies fit your community. In other words, they have to be responsive to the context and the culture of your community. And these approaches to build readiness are going to work best when they're co-identified by the coalition and your stakeholders. In other words, you want to build a partnership, and that's going to support your work going forward as well. Finally, sort of one caution, there really are no cookbook strategies to build readiness. These are inherently local. They're inherently responsive to community conditions. As you think about selecting approaches to build community readiness, your goal really is to identify and select a few approaches, typically between 1 and 3, that are going to fit the context and readiness level of your community. As you start to think about this, you can ask yourself this question. What needs to increase for your community to be willing to address suicide with comprehensive approaches and suicide prevention, and to be ready to partner with you? The question then is, how do you know what to do? And you'll know what to do as you continue to practice data-informed or data-driven decision-making. And here are some things that you're going to consider as you're starting to identify those strategies. Your overall readiness scores, those dimension scores, things you learn from the actual transcripts from your CRA interviews, quotes, other qualitative data, things that your key informants said. You're going to consider your knowledge about your local conditions in the context of your community. And you can get feedback and input from your colleagues, your coalition members, and your stakeholders in the community. As you think about selecting approaches, we encourage you to begin with the end in mind and think about how will you know readiness has increased. You can think about the changes you want to see in your community after you've implemented those approaches to build readiness. And part of this work to build readiness is going to involve monitoring, paying attention over time to how readiness is going to change related to willingness and the inability to mobilize on the issue of comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. It's important also for you to know that building community readiness may be an ongoing or iterative process. It will take time to build readiness. It's not something that is going to happen overnight. It may also be something that you have to do on an ongoing basis as your stakeholders change, as your community conditions change. All of those things can impact that level of readiness. Now we're going to present a couple examples of approaches to build community readiness. In this example, the community is scored in readiness stage 1, where there's no awareness of the issue. In other words, your community has absolutely no awareness of comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. Your end state is that you want to ensure that your community is aware of the issue, even if there is resistance to addressing it. That in itself is going to essentially move that readiness stage up an entire level. So example approaches that you could use might include sharing data about the problem of suicide at a coalition meeting, doing one-on-one visits or calls with stakeholders and community leaders, sharing information about resources and current efforts in the community related to comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention or the CDC technical package. Let's talk briefly now about example 2 of approaches to build community readiness. Let's say that your community is scored at a readiness stage of 2, which is denial or resistance. What this means is that the community is aware of the need for comprehensive approaches to suicide, but it may be in denial about suicides even happening in the community, or really may not want to do work to prevent suicide. Here, what you're going to want to do is to start to build willingness to add this as a problem of practice into your community's discussions and conversations. And you want to start to facilitate mobilization by your community around suicide prevention. Some example approaches could include one-on-one visits or calls with stakeholders and community leaders, discussing or sharing data about the extent of the problem, discussing local incidents and how the community can respond, and sharing information about resources, prevalence, or current efforts in the community related to suicide prevention. In our third example, the community is at readiness stage 4, which is pre-planning. What this means is that really the community is aware of comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention and/or the CDC technical package. They're mobilizing around the issue, and they seem to be willing to work on it, but they're not sure what can be done. And so here are approaches to build community readiness. Really, it's going to engage your community in that process to identify and build collective buy-in for specific strategies that might be used. And some of these example approaches could include introducing information about presentations or through presentations and media, about nuances of suicide prevention, and key intervening variables that might be addressed. It might involve reviewing existing efforts and gaps, assessing local resources and gaps, conducting local focus groups to discuss ideas, and to think about comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. It may also involve identifying evidence-based prevention practices related to comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. Looking deeply at those 7 CDC strategies, and looking at resources that fit the community context along with those key intervening variables associated with suicide prevention. And really working in an intentional manner to cultivate support and buy-in from your key community leaders. Now, these really are just examples of where a community might be, and some ways that it's possible to address community readiness and sort of build that readiness to engage. Let's talk next about creating a plan to build community readiness. You have a number of key resources to guide you in this process of creating a plan to build readiness. There's a guidance document called Creating a Plan to Develop Community Readiness. This really is going to provide you with step-by-step direction and guidance for creating that plan. You've got the Triethnic Model CRA Handbook. This was posted on the website with Segment 1. And as you think about these approaches, please reread and focus on pages 31 to 42 in the manual. They're very helpful, and they provide a lot of guidance on approaches and also how to select them. One of your deliverables is a community readiness planning template. In other words, the plan to build readiness. What's important now is that we've built the template for this, and wherever possible, we've included pre-filled text to limit the burden on you and your coalition for creating this plan. We've also embedded instructions and highlights where we need text from your coalition or where we need a summary of your CRA results. As you think about your timeline, please refer back to the guidance document. It has the timeline for developing this plan and also a due date for when this plan needs to be submitted. Let's break down the process for coalitions to build community readiness. And here are some key steps. The first is that you need to choose a group to create a plan to develop community readiness. We'd recommend choosing 3 to 5 coalition members. Depending on your coalition, it can be fewer people or it can be a larger number, whatever fits with the context of your coalition. And the people you choose, they might have been involved with the CRA process or they may be new to it. You don't have to have experience doing a CRA to be helpful with it, developing the plan. Next, you're going to circulate the coalition's CRA report. Really focus on what those results mean for your community's readiness for comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention, and really to start to think about what you and your coalition think might be needed to sort of start to build community readiness. You're going to engage your coalition members in conducting a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And in the plan, you're going to do that on a dimension-specific level. You're going to engage your coalitions in setting goals for increasing community readiness. You'll engage your coalition in choosing actions and approaches to develop community readiness, really based on the coalition's goals and where you are in the development process. You'll complete that community readiness planning template. You'll want to make sure that your coalition has time to review that and to provide input and feedback. Then you're going to finalize your community readiness planning template and submit it as a deliverable. Again, refer back to that guidance document for your timeline and also for submission guidance. Let's talk through very briefly the components of the community readiness planning template. When you open the template, you're first going to see a title page. And we're going to ask you to insert your coalition's name, a logo if you have it, the name of the coalition director or leader, and names of the people on your CRA team. Next, you're going to see an introduction. And this really is standardized, and you and your coalition don't need to edit this text. The third section involves building the community readiness planning team. And here, all you need to do is insert your coalition's name and the names of your CRA team members. After that, the planning template includes a brief review of CRA results. They'll ask you to insert a summary of your process, basic details about it. We'll ask you to input your overall and dimension-specific readiness scores. And we'll ask you to think about the implications of these scores for your community and for work on comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. The planning template next is going to ask you to input a summary of the results of the SWOT analysis. And again, think about this by dimension of community readiness and considering those dimension-specific readiness scores. And all you need to do is write a brief summary of the SWOT analysis, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and threats for each of those 5 dimensions. You'll then use this SWOT analysis to develop goals. Up to 3 goals to build community readiness. Earlier in this presentation, we talked a little bit about the fact that building readiness takes time. The goals that you set may be something that you can achieve in the short term, but it's very likely that your process of building readiness will be ongoing over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, this doesn't mean that during this time that you're not going to do any work on suicide prevention. It just means that it probably will take time for your coalition and community to be ready for comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention and ready to take action on those 7 CDC strategies. Consistent with those goals that you've just identified, you'll next identify up to 3 approaches to build community readiness. The plan will ask you to write a detailed description and rationale for each. We're going to ask you to explain or articulate the desired results from the approach, and ask you to consider things like capacity, how you'll evaluate it, and any barriers that you might run into. And that final part of your plan to build community readiness is what we call the action plan. You're going to take each of the approaches you've identified and essentially build out key activities under it. This action plan is really going to function as a work plan. It'll include a timeline for each of those activities. It will match coalition members with each activity so that you have a point of contact and someone responsible. And we'll ask you to include some process indicators, just tracking what's been done, what activities have been completed. What's important to know is that as you put together this action plan, this part of the plan really is a living, breathing document. Timelines will change. You may include other activities. So as you develop this plan for the first time, just realize that this action plan is not your forever plan. As you start to move forward, as you have new information, you can always go back and revise this part of your plan. You may or may not have ever created a community readiness development plan. So the link on the screen gives you examples of plans that have been created in the past. And in this case, for the Ohio SPIF PFS initiative. All you need to do is navigate to the website, select any of the counties that are shaded in red, look under the red section of deliverables titled Assessment, and choose Approach to Community Readiness. It may also be new for you or your coalition to conduct a SWOT analysis, where you identify those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The Swift PFS Initiative website also has great examples of completed SWOT analyses. It is important to know that these were completed, though, within the context of sustainability planning. Once again, you'll navigate to the website. You'll select any of the counties that are shaded in red. You can look under the gray section of deliverables called Sustainability and take a look at the sustainability plan. These plans will give you a sense of sort of how that SWOT analysis was implemented by these communities and also how it was summarized. This training segment is focused on a number of things: describing the next steps after CRA reporting has been completed, introducing strategies to build community readiness, and once again, the manual is going to be very helpful in this area, introducing the process for creating a plan to build community readiness around comprehensive approaches to suicide prevention. And here, the guidance document will be very important. And we've identified templates, guidance documents, and other supporting materials that are going to support your coalition's work to build out that plan to increase community readiness. As always, there are lots of resources on the webpage, including this video, supporting materials including this PowerPoint slide deck, a detailed step-by-step guidance document, and the planning